Hello, I'm Ashley Strauss-Martin, General Counsel for the New Mexico Association of Realtors, and today I'm here to talk about a new form, Form 2114, the Appraisal Contingency Waiver Addendum. As you all know, the last 18 months have been a little crazy. The market has been very competitive for buyers, and as a result, buyers are doing what they can to make their offer stand out, and this includes offering over list price and waiving contingencies. Currently, we do not have a form that simply waives the appraisal contingency. This form does that, but it also gives the parties some other options. The other issue that we're seeing quite frequently is appraisals that are coming in low. In most cases, neither the listing broker nor the sellers anticipate this is going to happen, so they're not planning for it. For example, the seller doesn't want to sell below $250,000. The buyer offers $250,000 or $5,000 over the appraisal, whichever is less. And both the listing broker and the seller is assuming that that appraisal is going to come in for at least $250,000, but it doesn't. It comes in at $220,000. Now the seller has agreed to sell for $225,000, $5,000 above the appraisal amount, but the seller isn't happy about it. And sellers are commonly just refusing to sell, which of course leaves the buyers and the sellers seeking legal counsel to address the issue. Enter the Appraisal Contingency Waiver Addendum. This addendum not only gives the option for a buyer to completely waive the appraisal contingency, but it also provides other options, two of which allow the seller to set an amount under which they will not sell the property. We call that the seller's floor, but more about that in a minute. At the top of page 1, there is a box, and it says important, read entire addendum carefully. And this is a directive to the buyer and the seller, because we want them to know all of the options available under this appraisal contingency waiver addendum so that they are making the selection as to which option they want or they can agree on. And the brokers are not being put in a position where they're making those choices for the buyer or the seller. So this box explains what this Appraisal Contingency Waiver Addendum does. It says that it is to be used to replace the appraisal contingency provisions of the purchase agreement. And if you're using MR Purchase Agreement Residential Resale, MR Form 2104, then the addendum replaces paragraph 9C in its entirety. It then goes on to say that if the buyer is obtaining an FHA or a VA loan, the lender will require the parties to sign an amendatory clause addendum that states that regardless of the parties' agreement in this addendum, the buyer shall have the right, though not the obligation, to terminate the agreement without penalty if the appraised value is less than the purchase price. So you have to remember the order of things. So the parties enter into this appraisal contingency waiver addendum, and then subsequent to that, when the buyer goes to get a loan, an FHA or VA loan, the lender will require both the buyer and the seller to sign an amendatory clause addendum. And the addendum says that if the appraisal amount comes in low, the buyer is not obligated to buy. Now, it's not to say the buyer can't buy, that they can't come to the table with additional funds. Of course they can, but they don't have the obligation to. So that contingency or that clause will supersede this addendum, and the buyer will no longer be obligated to perform on the contract in the event that the appraisal comes in low. And so you have to be aware that all this negotiation can take place on an FHA or VA loan. Subsequent to this, it will all be superseded by this amendatory clause addendum the lender will require. And in the event that the seller refuses to sign the amendatory clause addendum because they've negotiated this appraisal contingency waiver addendum and they want to stick with that, then the lender won't make the loan. And the buyer will receive a rejection letter from the lender. Paragraph 1 is entitled Modification of Appraisal Contingency, and next to that it says check only one option below. This is very important. If the buyer is creating this form with the purchase offer and sending it over, they have options A through E, and they're only going to choose one of those options. Only one of them. They're all very different options, so they're going to choose one of those options and send it over. Now, in the event that the seller wants to use this addendum but doesn't like the buyer's option, they're going to counter and they're going to attach their very own appraisal contingency waiver addendum indicating the option that the seller wants and send that back over to the buyer. So at any given time on the appraisal contingency waiver addendum, there will only be one option checked. So option A is a full waiver of the appraisal contingency, and it's to be used in the event that the buyer is obtaining a loan. not in the event that the buyer is obtaining, is financing through seller financing or paying cash. And we'll talk about that in a minute, only if they're getting a loan. And we've established that appraisal contingency in the purchase agreement. And here we're waiving it. It then goes on to say, however, that the buyer's lender is still going to require an appraisal, even if the buyer waives the appraisal contingency, and seller agrees to allow access to the property for the appraisal. Because we all know that even with the appraisal contingency waived, the lender is going to want to have an appraisal. So option A, again, is the full waiver of the appraisal contingency. There's an important note telling the buyer that what they're doing here is agreeing to pay the purchase price regardless of where the appraisal comes in. And then it says, if the buyer is obtaining a loan and if the buyer is required to deliver proof of funds per paragraph 2B, then within 2 days of the buyer's receipt of the appraisal, the buyer shall deliver a copy of the appraisal and proof of funds per paragraph 2B. Now, paragraph 2 informs the buyer that in the event that there is a difference between the amount of the loan that they're getting and the purchase price, that the buyer is going to be required to bring those funds to closing, right? They're going to have to bring that cash to closing. Paragraph 2B, which is an election, the parties agree that in the event that there is a difference, that the seller is entitled to see proof of funds from the buyer if paragraph 2B is checked. So in the event that they have checked paragraph 2B and the buyer is required to provide proof of funds, then the seller is going to need to see what the appraisal is, right? Because they need to see if there is a dollar amount that the buyer will have to bring to closing and how much that dollar amount is. And the only way they're going to know that is if they get a copy of the appraisal. So I have heard brokers say, well, in the event that the appraisal comes in high, I don't want to have to, the buyer may not want to provide a copy of that appraisal to the seller. Even though, we've all agreed we're going to pay the purchase price regardless, we don't even have an appraisal contingency, the buyer still might not want the seller to be aware that the appraisal came in really high. Well, in that case, you may not want to elect 2B, right? Because if you elect 2B, then you're saying that if there's a difference between the appraisal and the purchase price, then the buyer's going to have to bring those funds. But how is the seller going to know if there's a difference if the buyer hasn't provided a copy of the appraisal? So you want to keep that in mind when you're electing 2B if you have elected this option A. At the top of page 2, there's a paragraph that says options B through E are to be used if the buyer is either obtaining a loan or paying cash or purchasing the property with seller financing. And if this is a cash or seller finance transaction, then one of the following options would be selected if the buyer is requiring an appraisal and if the buyer will be partially waiving that appraisal. And then it goes on to say, in this event, the buyer shall select the appraiser. Now remember that this addendum replaces the entirety of paragraph 9C of the MR Form 2104, the Residential Resale Purchase Agreement. And paragraph 9C includes a provision for a cash or seller finance buyer to elect to have an appraisal. So if a cash or seller finance buyer elects to have an appraisal in paragraph 9C, they're not then going to use this addendum to waive the appraisal, which is option A. They would simply not elect to have an appraisal in paragraph 9C, and this form would never be used. But if they want an appraisal in paragraph 9C, they've elected to have an appraisal, but they want to partially waive that appraisal, then the remaining options B through E of this addendum would apply. And that's why this language is above option B and not above option A. Above option A, you'll see it says that option A applies to a loan because we have created an appraisal contingency in the purchase agreement for loans. And in the event that the buyer wants to waive that in its entirety, then they would use option A. But options B through E could be used for loans if they are going to get an appraisal, but they want to partially waive that. Or if they're doing cash or seller finance transactions where they have elected to have an appraisal, but they want to partially waive it. I'll also add that last sentence that says, in this event, the buyer shall select the appraiser. We don't talk about in paragraph 9C who pays for the appraiser, the appraisal. We used to, but we moved that into the cost to be paid grid. So now 9C only deals with who's going to select in the event that the buyer is paying cash or doing seller financing and wants to have an appraisal done. We only speak to who's going to select that appraiser, not who's going to pay for it. Who's going to pay for it, again, is now in the cost to be paid grid. Option B is a limited waiver of the appraisal contingency, and it says that buyers shall pay a certain amount over the appraised value up to the buyer's cap. And we modified this language a little bit. It didn't change the way that this paragraph works, but what we did do is we created in this option B and also in option D and E a provision that the buyer does not have to provide a copy of the appraisal unless the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap. So only in that event does the buyer have to provide a copy of the appraisal. So this section says that the buyer shall pay X number of dollars over the appraised value or X number of dollars, which we call the buyer's cap, the most amount the buyer is willing to pay, whichever is less. So if the amount, the appraisal comes in and the dollar amount over the appraised value is the lesser of those two numbers, that's what the buyer is going to pay. And if the buyer's cap is the lesser of those two numbers, then that's what the buyer is going to pay. But the buyer is never going to pay more than the buyer's cap. So in the event, after the appraisal comes in within 2 days of that, the buyer is going to have to provide to the seller a price modification amendment reflecting this ratified purchase price based on this amendment. And if applicable, proof of funds per paragraph 2B below, which we talked about a moment ago and we'll talk about again. And if the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap, a copy of the appraisal, but only in that event. So if the buyer is paying the buyer's cap, that's the very most that the buyer said that they would pay, it doesn't matter where the appraisal came in. It doesn't matter if the appraisal came in at the buyer's cap or $5,000 over or $10,000 over or $20,000 over. The buyer said they would only pay the buyer's cap. The seller agreed that that would be the most amount of money that the buyer would pay. And so if the appraisal comes in at or above the buyer's cap, there's no need to provide a copy of the appraisal to the seller. However, if the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap, then a copy of the appraisal needs to go to the seller, because then the seller is going to want to see, why am I not getting the buyer's cap? Well, it's because the ratified purchase price, the so much above the appraised value, is actually less than the buyer's cap. So the end goes on to talk about that notwithstanding the foregoing, if the buyer delivers the above required documents, then the addendum remains in full force and effect, even if the parties fail to execute a price modification amendment as required by this addendum. So what does that mean? We have a solid purchase price, right? We've got the appraisal in, and so we have a solid purchase price based on that appraisal in this language in option B. And what we don't want to happen is for one of the parties to say, well, I'm not going to execute a price modification amendment because I've changed my mind. I don't want to pay the buyer's cap. I don't want to accept the buyer's cap. I don't want to sell this property or buy this property for this amount of money that I've agreed to do so. And if I don't sign the price modification amendment, well, then I just don't have to, right? We just don't have a deal. And so what this language says is, yes, we do have a deal. We have a solid purchase price based on the appraisal and this language right here. And we want to ratify that because that makes it clear to everybody what that purchase price is. However, even if one of the parties fails to do so, refuses to do so, we still have a contract. We still have a deal, even if one of the parties refuses to sign that price modification amendment. Option C is the same type language as we saw in B, only in this case, the buyer will pay the greater of two amounts. So again, the buyer has made a purchase offer, and we're going to wait and see what the appraisal comes in, because the buyer is willing to pay so much above the appraisal amount or the purchase price, whichever shall be greater. We have two numbers, and the greater of those is what the buyer is willing to pay under this option C. And it's the same process. Within 2 days of the buyer's receipt of the appraisal, they're going to deliver that to the seller. They're going to deliver a modification, price modification amendment, and they're going to deliver, if applicable, proof of funds per paragraph 2. And again, that same language talking about, we're going to solidify this price in this price modification, but in the event that we don't, we do have a solid purchase price based on this information here. We have the appraisal and we have this option C. And between those two things, we can come up with a solid purchase price that the parties have agreed upon. So even if one of the parties or even both of the parties refuse to sign that price modification, we still have a contract. We still have a deal. Options D and E are a little more complicated because they're taking into consideration an appraisal that comes in low, and we're trying to set a dollar amount under which the seller is not required to sell. So the 3 bullets explain what this option D does. If the property appraises at or above a certain amount, the buyer shall pay the lesser of two numbers. And if the property appraises below a certain amount, the buyer shall pay the greater of two numbers. Now this option allows the buyer to set forth the highest purchase price they're willing to pay. That's the buyer's cap. And it allows the seller to set forth the lowest purchase price they are willing to accept, which is we call the seller's floor. Now, this information between the two yellow triangles is very important, obviously. It says that all spaces below marked with an asterisk must have the same number. So you have to remember, in this scenario, we're talking about if a property appraises for a certain dollar amount or more, and if the property appraises for less than a certain dollar amount. So those two numbers have to be the same, and we're going to be working with the vendors to see if we can get those to auto-populate. So when you put in the first number, it will automatically populate into that second space. But you have to be cognizant of the fact that those need to be the same numbers and making sure that they're the same numbers. So let's look at the first one. It says if the property appraises for a certain dollar amount or more, then the buyer shall pay X number of dollars over the appraised value or X number of dollars, which we call the buyer's cap, whichever is less. And the lesser of these two amounts is the ratified purchase price. And then the second one says if the property appraises for less than a certain dollar amount, buyer shall pay X number of dollars over the appraisal or X amount, which is the seller's floor, whichever is greater. And the greater of these two amounts is the ratified purchase price. And then we go on to say that there needs to be a price modification amendment reflecting that ratified purchase price that is sent from the buyer over to the seller within 2 days of the buyer getting the appraisal. So within 2 days of the buyer receiving the appraisal, then the buyer is going to send that price modification amendment over, along with a copy of the appraisal, if the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap. So in the event that the appraisal has come in for X dollars or more, and it takes the purchase price all the way up to the buyer's cap, then the buyer does not have to provide a copy of the appraisal. The buyer's cap is the most that the buyer agreed to pay. The seller accepted that. It doesn't matter what the appraisal says, and therefore the appraisal does not have to go over with the price modification amendment if the buyer is buying for the buyer's cap. In the event that the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap, then a copy of the appraisal needs to go over, because now we're saying that the ratified purchase price is dependent on this appraisal. It's going to not take it all the way up to the buyer's cap. So what is that dollar amount? Well, we're going to have to look at that appraisal to make that determination, and the seller has a right to see the copy of the appraisal for that purpose. So again, if the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap, then a copy of the appraisal is going over with the price modification form, and if applicable, that proof of funds per paragraph to be below. And then again, you see this language, notwithstanding the foregoing, if the buyer delivers the foregoing, this addendum remains in full force and effect, even if the parties fail to execute the price modification amendment. And again, we're using this language to say, hey, we've got a solid purchase price. Once we know what the appraisal amount is, we can plug that number in here and we know exactly what our purchase price is going to be. We want to create this price modification amendment, right, to ratify that purchase price. But if you had one party to the transaction deciding they didn't want to sign that price modification amendment, thinking that if they didn't sign it, that you don't have a contract, that you don't have a deal, we want to reiterate the fact that there is a deal, because we have come up with a dollar amount now that we know the appraisal. We have a solid purchase price, even if the parties do not execute that price modification amendment. So this is a more complicated concept, and I'm going to break it down on the next slide. But you see here that we are creating a buyer cap and we are creating a seller's floor. So this is kind of the introduction of the seller's floor. So I said we would break it down, and let's do that. Let's plug in some numbers and break this down. Okay, so under option D, we have two scenarios. We have one where the property appraises for a certain dollar amount or more, and we have one scenario where it appraises for less than a certain dollar amount. So let's use 300,000. And you'll notice the very first thing you have to do is plug in the same number. You have to say if the property appraises for 300,000 or more, and you have to say if the property appraises for less than 300,000, right? Because that's all the extent of all of the scenarios that we could be presented with. Is it's going to be 300,000 or more, or it's going to be less than 300. So if the property appraises for 300,000 or more, the buyer shall pay $5,000 over the appraisal amount, or $325,000, which we call the buyer's cap, whichever is less. Okay, so we plugged in 300,000 is our amount for if the property appraises for, and then we plugged in $5,000 for over the appraisal amount, and then we plugged in $325 as the buyer's cap. Okay, so if the property appraises for $300,000 or more, then the buyer is going to pay $5,000 over the appraisal or $325,000, whichever is less. So under this scenario, the seller will get at least $305,000, right? Because we're talking about an appraisal that came in for $300,000 or more. So let's say it comes in right at $300,000, right? The buyer has agreed to pay $5,000 over the appraisal amount, right? So the seller is guaranteed to get at least $305,000, and the buyer will pay no more than $325,000. So if the appraisal comes in over $300,000, let's say it comes in at $325,000, they're still just paying $325,000 because that's their cap, and they're paying the lesser of those two numbers, $5,000 over the appraisal or $325,000. Okay. So let's look at the other side of this. This is the second scenario. Again, you're plugging in the same $300,000. If the property appraises for less than $300,000, the buyer shall pay so much over the appraisal amount. We're going to say $5,000 over the appraisal amount, or $300,000, and this is the seller's floor. Whichever of those two numbers is greater, whichever is more. So in this example, the seller will get at least $300,000, right? Because $5,000 over the appraisal or $300,000, whichever is greater, right? So if $5,000 over the appraisal is greater, then they're going to get more than $300,000. But if $300,000 is greater, then they're guaranteed to get the $300,000. And you have to remember, we're dealing with an appraisal that comes in less than $300,000. So if it comes in at $299,000, they're going to get $5,000 over the appraisal amount. If it comes in at $290,000, they're going to get $300,000 because they're getting the greater of those two numbers under that scenario. So the seller will get at least $300,000, but the buyer will pay no more than $304,999. Now, where did that number come from? Well, if the property appraises for less than $300,000, remember, if it appraises for $300,000 or more, we're not looking at this side at all. We're jumping over to the blue side, right? Because that's $300,000 or more. So what scenario would it fall under on the right side? Anything less than $300,000. So let's say it came in at $299,999, right? Right under $300,000. Really couldn't get any closer than that, right? If we're not talking cents, we're just talking dollars. $5,000 on top of that, right, is going to put you at $304,999. So that is the very most that the buyer is going to be required to pay here, is the $304,999 under this scenario, right? And then the very least that they're going to pay is the $300,000. So they have a pretty small window there. They kind of, that they can count on. I mean, you're going to pay $300,000. I'm going to pay $304,999. That's the range that I have under this scenario in the green on the right-hand side. So option E is the most complicated of the options because it has the most flexibility. It creates a solid purchase price if the appraisal comes in at a certain dollar amount or more, but it allows the parties to go back to the drawing board, renegotiate the purchase price if the appraisal comes in low. So the two bullets under option E explain this. If the property appraises for at or above a certain amount, then the buyer shall pay the lesser of two numbers. And if the property appraises below a certain amount, then the buyer has the option of buying for a certain amount. But if the buyer opts not to buy for that amount, then the parties may renegotiate a purchase price. Again, we have that very important language that says that all spaces marked with the asterisk must have the same number, because we're talking about if the property appraises for so much or more, and versus if the property appraises for less than a certain dollar amount. So those need to be the same numbers. Let's look at the first one. If the property appraises for so much or more, buyer shall pay X number of dollars over the appraised value up to the buyer's cap, whichever is less. And the lesser of these two numbers is the ratified purchase price. And we say that in the event the property appraises for so much or more, so that we've determined what this ratified purchase price is, then within 2 days of the buyer's receipt of the appraisal, the buyer shall deliver to seller the ratified purchase price within a price modification agreement, a copy of the appraisal if the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap. Now remember that the buyer's cap is the most the buyer is willing to pay. So if the appraisal comes in and the ratified purchase price ends up being the buyer's cap, then everybody's agreed that's the most that the buyer is going to pay. And it's not necessary to send over a copy of the appraisal because it doesn't matter what the appraisal says. Everybody's agreed the buyer's cap is the purchase price. But in the event that the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap, then whatever that ratified purchase price is going to be dependent on that appraisal. And the seller has a right to see a copy of that appraisal to make sure that ratified purchase price is correct based on that appraisal. So if the ratified purchase price is less than the buyer's cap, a copy of the appraisal is going over with the price modification amendment and the proof of funds, if applicable, per paragraph 2B below. And then we have that same, notwithstanding the foregoing language, we still have an agreement because, again, we have a solid number that we've come up with now that we have the appraisal. We have a solid number if indeed the property appraises for over a certain dollar amount. But in the second scenario, if the property appraises for less than a certain dollar amount, then the buyer shall deliver a copy of the appraisal to the seller within 2 days of buyer's receipt of the appraisal, and one of the following will occur within 3 days of the seller's receipt of the appraisal. Number 1, buyer shall have the right but not the obligation to purchase the property for a certain dollar amount, and this is the seller's floor. So the seller gets to say, again, what is the least amount that they are willing to sell for, and they get to put whatever dollar amount they want in here. Now, the question has come up: how are we going to know what the seller's floor is? Whether it be an D or an E, if I'm a buyer's broker and I'm completing this, how am I going to know what the seller's floor is? Well, a couple of things. Number 1, the buyer's broker can reach out to the listing broker and find out what the seller's floor is and plug that number in there. But the other option is for the buyer to make whatever option they want to, whether it be, option, B or C or D or E with the seller's floor as they want it in there, and send it over. And then this form can also be used in a counteroffer. So in the event that the seller doesn't like that number, that seller floor number, or doesn't like the option that the buyer chose, maybe the buyer chose option B and seller likes option D or E, then they'll use a counteroffer, attach this addendum to it, and select the option that the seller wants. And that'll give the seller an opportunity not only to select the option the seller wants, but also to fill in the seller's floor at the dollar amount that the seller wants. So a couple of ways that seller's floor could be established. But that's the amount that the seller is willing to pay for if you get an appraisal that comes in low. And if the buyer elects to purchase a property for the seller's floor, then the buyer shall deliver to the seller a price modification agreement reflecting the seller's floor and, if applicable, those proof of funds per paragraph 2B. And again, the notwithstanding language, because again, we have a solid number, right? We say if the appraisal comes in below a certain dollar amount and the seller has set the floor and the buyer wants to buy for that floor, then they have the option to do so. Or the parties may renegotiate a purchase price. So if the buyer doesn't want to pay the seller's floor, and the ball is in the buyer's court to determine if they want to pay that seller's floor amount, if they say, I don't want to pay the seller's floor amount, I want to go back to the drawing board, then the parties may renegotiate a purchase price, right? So they go back to renegotiating. And if the parties renegotiate a purchase price, and the parties shall fully execute a price modification amendment reflecting this renegotiated purchase price, and if applicable, the proof of funds per paragraph 2B below. And if the buyer does not exercise their option to purchase for the seller's floor and the parties fail to execute a price modification amendment with the renegotiated purchase price within 3 days of the seller's receipt of the appraisal, then the agreement is going to automatically terminate and the earnest money, if it was delivered, shall be refunded to buyer. So we're giving some time for this to happen, right? We're having 2 days for the buyer to provide a copy of the appraisal, 3 more days for the parties, for the buyer to either elect to buy for the seller's floor or for the parties to renegotiate a purchase price. And if none of that happens within 3 days of the seller's receipt of the appraisal, then the contract's going to automatically terminate and the earnest money is going to go back to the buyers. Okay, let's break down this option E. Once again, the screen is divided in 2 sections. If the property appraises for a certain dollar amount or more, and if the property appraises for less than a certain dollar amount, and we plugged in the same number, $300,000 on both sides. So let's start on the left. If the property appraises for $300,000 or more, the buyer shall pay, and we plugged in $5,000 over the appraisal, or $325,000, which is the buyer's cap, whichever is less. So in this example, the seller will get at least $305,000, right? Because we said if the property is appraising for $300,000 or more. So we're only on this side of the screen in the event that it appraises for at least $300,000. So let's say it comes in at $300,000, right at $300,000. The buyer has agreed to pay $5,000 over the appraisal amount up to $325,000. So obviously $5,000 over the appraisal amount, if it appraises for $300,000, is going to be less than the $325,000. So 305 is the amount that the seller would get in that scenario. And the buyer will pay no more than 325. They're not going to pay anything more than their cap. So in the event that it appraises for 325, they're not going to pay 330. They're not going to pay the appraisal amount plus 5,000. They're going to pay 325 because, again, that's the buyer's cap. Now let's jump over to the other side. If the property appraises for less than 300,000, if the property appraises for less than 300,000, then the buyer has the right to purchase for 305,000 in this scenario. So the seller has determined that if the appraisal comes in below a certain amount, this is what the seller is still willing to sell for, right? And they've plugged in 305 here. They could have plugged in 300. They could have plugged in, 290. They could have plugged in other numbers or something even higher, right? 320,000. But that's the seller's floor. That's the least amount that the seller will agree to sell for. Now remember that the buyer has the right to purchase for this seller floor, but not the obligation. So they are not obligated to purchase for the seller's floor. But within 3 days from the date that the buyer provides a copy of the appraisal to the seller, the buyer can either exercise the right to purchase for the seller floor, or the parties can renegotiate a price. So in the event that the buyer is exercising their right, they're going to create a price modification and send it over. Even if the seller doesn't sign it, the seller is still obligated to sell for the seller's floor. But in the event that the buyer doesn't wish to exercise their right, then the parties can go back to the drawing board, renegotiate a purchase price. Now, if nothing happens within 3 days from delivery of the appraisal to the seller, then the contract's going to automatically terminate and any earnest money is going to go back to the buyer. So in this example on the right, the seller has to sell for $305,000 if the buyer opts to buy at $305,000. But the buyer has not agreed to buy at all, right? They could not exercise their right and they could not renegotiate a price. So the buyer is not obligated in any way. The seller is obligated to sell for the seller's floor. But if the buyer doesn't opt to do that, then the parties are renegotiating and there's no dollar amount beyond the seller's floor that the seller is obligated to sell for. Before we move away from options D and E, I want to make a comment about the seller's floor because I've already gotten questions about how would a buyer or buyer's broker know what the seller's floor is when they're completing this form to send in with their offer. And I have a few things to say about that. First of all, I don't anticipate that options D and E will be utilized by buyers or buyer's brokers very often. It creates a seller's floor for the protection of the seller. So what I anticipate is going to happen is that the buyer is going to send over perhaps an option B, and as I said earlier in the presentation, the seller would then create a counteroffer, sending the counteroffer back with their own version of the addendum, opting for D or E and setting a seller's floor. So I anticipate that that's the way D and E will more traditionally be used. But another way it could be used is that the buyer could just set the dollar amount for the seller's floor, saying that no matter what happens, I'm going to be willing to pay you X number of dollars, right? So remember, seller's floor only comes into play if the appraisal comes in below a certain dollar amount. So if it comes in below a certain dollar amount, I, as the buyer, am going to agree to pay you this dollar amount. And again, if the seller doesn't like that dollar amount, they'll create a counteroffer and they'll opt maybe for that same option D or E, but they'll set a different seller's floor. They'll fill in a different number there. The buyer's broker can always ask the listing broker about the seller's floor. Is there a dollar amount that we could put in here that would make the seller feel good? But a couple of things. First of all, it's giving away the seller's floor, right? So it's telling the buyer this is an amount that the seller would be willing to sell for. Now, granted, there are conditions under which the seller would be willing to sell for that. That's in the event that the appraisal comes in below a certain dollar amount, and that's the only condition that's going to trigger the seller's floor. But so it may or may not be a number that the listing broker and the seller want to share. Also, keep in mind that broker duties does say that the buyer's broker can't say the maximum amount that the buyer is willing to pay, but we do that with the buyer's cap. And the listing broker is not supposed to say the least amount that the seller will take, but we're doing that with the seller's floor. So again, we as long as you have permission from the parties, right, to disclose this information and to include this information, then you're okay. And you also have to remember that if that question had been asked of the listing broker and they've cleared it with their seller that they can give the buyer's broker a number for the seller's floor, and then that comes over and the seller says, I don't like that number. I've changed my mind. I don't want to sell for that. Even if the appraisal appraisal came in low, then they just don't sign, that offer. They counter that offer, or they reject that offer. So it's not as if by telling them that number, they have obligated the seller to sell for that dollar amount if the appraisal comes in low. The seller's going to have another bite at that apple or another opportunity to say, yeah, that's a good number, or it's not a good number. So those are my thoughts on the seller's floor, and how it kind of factors into this whole analysis. And that finally brings us to paragraph 2, which is our cash funds at closing. So if the buyer is securing a loan to purchase the property and the buyer has agreed to pay more than the appraised value under any of the foregoing options, then the buyer agrees as follows: to pay by the funding date and readily available funds any difference between the amount of the loan and the final purchase price is modified by this addendum. We call that the difference. And then if 2B is checked, it says that the buyer is going to provide to the seller proof of funds for the difference. And again, the difference is the amount between the loan and the amount that the buyer has agreed to pay. They're going to have to come up with those funds because they're not coming from the lender, and they're going to have to bring those to closing. And the seller wants to see proof that the buyer is in a position to do that. And as far as how much time the buyer has to provide those proof, as you recall, as we went through each of those options, it specifically provides that those funds will be provided at a certain time, whether it be 2 days in most cases, or if there's renegotiation in that 5-day period. And then paragraph 3 is for other changes. So whether it be other changes to the purchase agreement, if this is coming over as an addendum with the offer, it may be additional things that the buyer wants to add or something that they want to take away from the purchase agreement. And in the event that this is used as a counteroffer or with a counteroffer, then the seller could put other counteroffer terms in that paragraph 3. And then we have 2 acknowledgement sections, disclaimer acknowledgement sections, and we have these above each of the signature lines because we really want the buyer and the seller to read these before they sign and emphasize the importance of this disclaimer and acknowledgement. So as buyer has read and understand the terms of this addendum and acknowledges that neither the broker nor the brokerage can guarantee or control the amount for which the property will appraise. And the buyer acknowledges and affirms that this waiver of any or all of the appraisal contingency has been made of their own volition and discretion, and buyer agrees to forever hold harmless the brokers and the brokerages with regard to this waiver. And then above the sellers, something similar, a little bit different. Seller has read and understands the terms of this addendum and acknowledges that neither the broker nor the brokerages can guarantee or control the amount for which the property will appraise. Seller acknowledges and affirms that the option chosen in this addendum, and if applicable, the amount of the seller's floor has been made of their own volition and discretion, and seller agrees to forever hold harmless the brokers and brokerages with regard to the option chosen and the amount of the seller's floor. So again, we want to emphasize the importance of what they're doing. And we put all of these options on one form very specifically because we could have created different options on different forms, but instead we wanted them all available for the parties to review so that the parties are, again, choosing the option that they can agree upon and not relying on the brokers to tell them what option they should choose. We covered a lot today in the Appraisal Contingency Waiver Addendum, and if you have further questions, feel free to give me a call on the hotline at 1-877-699-7266 or email me at legalhotline@nmrealtor.com. Thanks very much and have a wonderful day.